Greetings. It is a pleasure to be here today to talk about 20 years is enough. It's time to update the Agile principles and values. One of the principles in Agile is inspect and adapt, and I think we're past the point where we really should have been applying inspect and adapt to the Agile principles themselves. So I'd like to take an opportunity today to do that. So let's just go ahead and dive right in and see what we've got on that front. I think if we look at the brief history of software development, to me, software development looks like this. In the 1970s, teams used code and fix, and they were at least honest about that. In the 1980s, teams began to use structured methods. In the 1990s, teams began to use object-oriented methods. And then in the 2000s, teams used agile methods, or at least that's what they said. I think what was really going on in these periods is that in the 1970s, teams really did use code and fix. In the 1980s, teams actually gave lip service to structured methods, but what they were really doing was using code and fix. And then in the 1990s, they gave lip service to object-oriented methods, but they were really using code and fix. And in the 2000s, I think we have continued to see teams give lip service now to agile methods, but in many cases, they're still really using code and fix. So what's really been going on in terms of the Agile history? Well, I think if we go back to circa 2001, when the Agile Manifesto was written, one of my themes today is that 2001 was a long time ago. So I like the word circa because when you say circa, it makes it sound like it was a long time ago, ancient history, and it kind of was. So back in 2001, circa 2001, when the Agile Manifesto was written, the most common software development practice was code and fix. And what we were seeing in that era was that the SW-CMM, which was this very formal, structured approach to improving software processes, the SW-CMM had become increasingly popular, largely as a response to code and fix. And there were a lot of problems with the SW-CMM. One is that it was designed for large government projects in contracting environments, and as such, it was perceived as bureaucratic. And then there were many inexpert implementations of the SW-CMM. It was big, it was complicated. It was, in fact, bureaucratic in some ways, and the inexpert applications of it were painfully so. The SW-CMM, moreover, was never intended for small projects. And I think that virtually any implementation of the SW-CMM would have been too bureaucratic for small projects. So there were some problems with the SW-CMM. And we have to add to this the fact that most projects are small projects. So this response to code and fix, which was popular circa 2001, 20 years ago, really was not a very good solution for problems teams were having with smaller projects. And if we look at the Agile Manifesto, the original manifesto written 20 years ago, this really was largely a reaction to the SW-CMM. When we look at the Agile Values, individuals' interactions over processes and tools, the CMM was very process heavy. Working software over comprehensive documentation. Well, again, the CMM was very documentation heavy as well. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. The CMM was designed for government contracting environments, so contract negotiation was a feature. And then responding to change over following a plan, yes, there was lots and lots of planning in the SW-CMM. But, so to summarize, a lot of the Agile Manifesto, I think, was reactions to the SW-CMM at the time. But here is the news flash. The news flash is, it isn't 2001 anymore. In fact, the SW-CMM was sunsetted almost 20 years ago. And I think today, Agile's biggest enemy is not the SW-CMM. Agile's biggest enemy is now itself. Let me give you some specifics about what I mean by that. I think that Agile has become institutionalized. Some people have talked about the Agile industrial complex, which is a funny phrase that I think is more apt than it should be, really. And the very concept of institutionalizing Agile, I think, is anti-Agile. When you institutionalize something, you formalize it, you calcify it, you make it hard to change. So institutionalizing Agile, I think, is really anti-Agile. And I think one of the most prominent examples of this is the Scrum Guide. And this has to be my nominee for the most ridiculous statement of the last 10 years, which is the Scrum framework as outlined here is immutable. And this is from the current Scrum Guide as well as some prior versions of the Scrum Guide. Well, the history of the Scrum Guide looks like this. In February 2010, the first version came out. In July 2011, the second version came out, and it announced that Scrum was immutable. The third version came out about a year later, or actually a few months later, and this gave the first changes to supposedly immutable Scrum. And then the fourth version came out in 2013, the third version of immutable Scrum. The fifth version came out in 2016. Now we have 4 versions of immutable Scrum. The sixth version came out overall in November of 2017. So now we've got changes to the first through the fourth versions of immutable Scrum. And then most recently, November 2020, the 7th version overall came out. And now we've had 6 different versions of immutable Scrum. So some people might say, oh, you're being unfair. It's not Scrum that's immutable. It's the framework that's immutable. Well, what is the Scrum so-called framework? According to the 6th version of the Immutable Scrum Guide, Scrum is a lightweight framework. In other words, Scrum and the framework are inseparable. They are the same thing. And so then we have this statement in the most recent version of the Scrum Guide that the Scrum framework is purposefully incomplete. But the problem with it being purposefully incomplete is that it's immutable. We'll never be able to complete it because we're not allowed to change things that are immutable. And so don't get me wrong. I love Scrum. I think it's been a huge game changer in software. I think it's arguably the single most valuable practice that's been associated with Agile development. But the claim that Scrum is immutable is absurd. I think it lacks self-awareness, and I think it's anti-Agile. The idea that we're not allowed to change something is just ridiculous. For one thing, you can't have 6 different versions of something that's immutable. For another thing, if we discover a way to make Scrum better through practice, aren't we allowed to change it? Isn't that, in fact, the essence of Agile? Well, of course, this is not immutable, and furthermore, it should not be immutable. So my overall point here is that Agile practices are not static. They should not be static. Indeed, the idea of them being static is contrary to the spirit of Agile. And I think that undue fixation on these 20-year-old artifacts gives rise to some non-practical and non-engineering considerations or attitudes that really have very little to do with business and engineering. I hear phrases like, is such and such truly Agile? I don't care if it's truly Agile. Why would I care what label I put on it? What I care is, does it work? Is it effective? If you want to label it or categorize it or classify it as Agile, great. I don't care. What I care about is whether it actually is effective. And that's what businesses and engineering approaches care about. Is such and such truly Scrum is another phrase that I think has no place in Scrum or in Agile. You can say, is this implementation of Scrum working? Does it match the needs of the organization? Are there ways to make it better? Those would be business and engineering statements, but the idea of is such and such truly Scrum is neither business nor an engineering statement. I think has no place in Agile development. So with that as background, let's go ahead and update the Agile principles and values. And before we do that, let me tell you what I'm going to talk about today. Number one, I'm going to give a brief history of Agile, which I've just done. Second, I want to give you a little bit of background on my perspective on Agile. That'll just take about 1 minute. Then I want to review the Agile values one by one, review the Agile principles one by one, and then see where we are today, 20 years after the original principles and values were created. Well, the basis of my perspective, of course, includes working with many companies, which I've done for a long time now. But I also draw heavily on this book that I published at the end of 2019 called More Effective Agile. The review process that I used for this book was to draw in review comments from more than 300 reviewers. About 3/4 of those reviewers were senior leaders, that is to say directors, VPs, and so on. And what I love about putting a book out for review or a manuscript out for review is that most people who review a manuscript only give you comments on the areas where they are the most interested or where they have the best background or the most knowledge or that they've thought about a lot. And so what that means is that I get to be the recipient of a lot of people's best thinking. I get to be the recipient of comments where they care the most. And in total, I got about 10,000 review comments on the manuscript, which is vastly more than I was expecting. I ended up delaying publication of the book by about 3 months because there were so many good comments that I really wanted to make sure I considered those as I finalized the manuscript. And the overall effect of this is that I think the review is extensive enough that the book itself could be characterized as representing the state of the practice of Agile development as of about a year and a half or 2 years ago. So that really is a huge background or basis of my perspective as well. So let's take a look at a 2021 review of the Agile values. The first value is individuals and interactions over processes and tools. And I think we have to be honest and say that Agile in 2021 focused extensively on processes and tools. I don't think that this statement meaningfully characterizes Agile today. For example, if we want to say, does Agile have anything to do with processes? Well, I think the most recognizable Scrum diagram is a process flow diagram. Indeed, the Scrum Alliance has a stylized version of a process flow diagram as its logo. This thing in the upper portion here is a process flow diagram, and then the Scrum Alliance logo is a stylized process flow diagram. So clearly, we are doing something with processes and relying heavily on them in Agile development. In terms of tools, we have this crazy periodic table of DevOps tools that's been updated a few times now. And wow, there are a lot of tools there. I don't see how anybody could look at that and say Agile hasn't absolutely embraced tools. And so this statement that Agile is about individuals' interactions over processes and tools, I think is just out of touch with how Agile is being practiced today. It does not meaningfully characterize Agile today. I don't think that it really is useful to look at this anymore. The second value is working software over comprehensive documentation. And I think back in circa 2001, this contrast was motivated by a pretty widespread implementation of overly bureaucratic practices, specifically in the software CMM. But I think today the more relevant contrast is between just-in-time practices, which do have the value of minimizing documentation, versus big batch upfront practices. In other words, it's not comprehensive documentation per se, it's more about when the documentation is generated and whether it's generated in big batches or small batches just in time. But I don't see the issue as being about documentation. The issue is really about batch size, and documentation is just a side effect of that. And so if we were going to characterize where Agile is today, I think large versus small batch size is more of the meaningful characterization, and I think we would put less of an emphasis on documentation itself. The third value is customer collaboration over contract negotiation. To be blunt, I think this was always a specious comparison. I think this might have come up in some software CMM contracting environments, but most software was never developed under the software CMM in the first place. It was popular in some circles 20 years ago, but I think that most software development typically occurs in-house, does not involve contract negotiation, and I think this was never really that meaningful a comparison. And I think as we come up to 2021, in some ways this whole notion of the interaction with the customer has become a bit of an Achilles heel for Agile teams. I think the Achilles heel is that Agile teams sometimes think that they know more about what the customer wants than the customer does themselves. And the real value here, I think, should just be customer collaboration, full stop. Not over anything else, just customer collaboration. And it just really drives me crazy when I see Agile teams thinking that because they read some Agile pundit somewhere say that customers should care about something, that therefore that means their customers care about something. No. The whole point here is go talk to your customer, find out what your customer wants, and that is the notion of customer collaboration. The fourth value is responding to change over following a plan. And I think this was a valid comparison 20 years ago. However, today, I think that there is a lot of planning in Agile. And as with the documentation, the contrast really isn't about planning or even about how much planning occurs. It's more about when planning occurs. And I think this value could be better stated today, and in fact often is stated as deferring detailed planning to the last responsible moment, rather than creating detailed plans up front. We certainly hear Agile teams talking a lot about last responsible moment, but that hasn't really been flowed back into the statement of Agile values, which I think it should be. So my overall summary of the Agile values in 2021 is that I think 20 years later, they appear to be quite out of date. I don't think they reflect Agile as it's practiced today. I think it's possible to shift the words and shift the meaning of the words and reinterpret the phrases and so on. But I don't think that that's a useful exercise. And I think we really could fairly say that while these values served a useful purpose 20 years ago, today they're not really serving the same useful purpose anymore. Let's turn now to the review of Agile principles and see how those look 20 years later. The first principle is that our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. Clearly, I think satisfying the customer is still a really good principle, but this statement, through early and continuous delivery of valuable software, I think overly constrains this principle. I think this is a maybe. Sometimes this is a good principle, but sometimes it doesn't. I think it really depends on the customer. I think this brings us back to the value really of customer collaboration and just making sure we understand what the customer is prioritizing, what they value. And so I think this principle, the heart of this principle is in the right place, but overall I think this principle was overly specific. The second principle is welcome changing requirements even late in development. Agile processes harness change for the customer's competitive advantage. I think clearly 20 years later, Agile still welcomes changing requirements. But I think today, back 20 years ago, I think that was the primary plan. The primary plan was do as little as possible up front and just expect everything will change and then roll with it. I think in today, that's really the backup plan rather than the primary emphasis. The primary emphasis now is on avoiding doing anything that will need to be changed later, which is to say doing requirements just in time, but not changing requirements per se. It's just doing them at the last responsible moment so that we don't have a lot of changes that we have to deal with. If we do encounter changes, of course, we're still going to deal with them. But again, I think that's the backup plan rather than the primary emphasis. And so I think this is an example of a principle that is outdated. The next principle is delivering working software frequently from a couple of weeks to a couple of months with a preference to the shorter time scale. And I have to say, I think this seems terribly outdated at a time when major companies like Amazon are delivering hundreds or thousands of times a day. I think the spirit of this principle is intact, but the wording is outdated, primarily because it's overly specific. And I've highlighted primarily because it's overly specific because I think that ends up becoming a theme with these principles where in many cases the spirit is intact, but the detailed wording really has not stood the test of time. The next principle is business people and developers must work together daily throughout the project. Yes, of course, the general idea of business people and developers collaborating is intact, but the specific statement of working together daily, I think, ignores 20 years of learning on how we want to go about Agile development. For example, it ignores the widespread use of the product owner role where, we kind of work with the customer if we want to define the product owner as the customer, but really it's not the developers who are working throughout the project. It's the product owner who is working with the business people in many organizations. And so here too, I think the spirit of the principle is intact. That is, in general, the business people and the technical people should collaborate in a constructive way and on a frequent basis. But the specifics of business people and developers specifically working together daily, I think, once again, are overly specific and haven't really kept up with the times. The next principle is build projects around motivated individuals, give them the environment and support they need, and trust them to get the job done. This is still valid, but this is just absolute motherhood and apple pie management 101. And it's hard to imagine what this really has to do with Agile. Basically, the contrast here is not some development approach that's not Agile. The contrast here is bad management. And as such, I think this is not really a meaningful principle for Agile development and really never was. It's a great statement. It's a great management statement. Just doesn't really contrast Agile software development with any other kind of effective software development. The next principle is the most efficient and effective method of conveying information to and within a development team is face-to-face conversation. And this is really an interesting one, maybe the most interesting one in the talk to be giving this talk in 2021. In 2019, I would have said this principle is still valid. I would have said, yes, absolutely, face-to-face, in-person conversation is most valuable. But after the experience of 2020 through 2021 with teams mostly moving to a work from home status, at least for a while, and then some teams going back to in-person, and many teams remaining distributed and working from home. I have to say, I think the jury is still out on this one. And maybe next year we'll be able to update this and say whether the most efficient and effective method is face-to-face or can be remote. But I think we've learned an awful lot about how to work effectively remotely over the last couple of years. So this one, I think the jury is really out. The next principle is that working software is the primary measure of progress. And I'm of two minds on this particular one. I think in one sense this seems like a little bit of an out-of-date, archaic reaction to the bulky bureaucratic project status reports and techniques that were in use in circa 2001. I mean, back in 2001, individuals and teams were still writing status reports on a weekly basis to communicate status. I couldn't even tell you when the last time I heard of an individual or team writing a status report was today. So in that sense, it seems kind of out of date. But in another sense, I think we still see the tendency on Agile teams to value activity over progress. It's really, people have a hard time resisting the temptation to look busy or feel busy over making actual progress. And I think as a litmus test statement that keeps us focused on the measure of progress is actual progress, actual working software, I think this is still a meaningful statement 20 years later. The next principle is Agile processes promote sustainable development. The sponsors, developers, and users should be able to maintain a constant pace indefinitely. Here I think we've got a couple of specific nits to pick with this statement. One is processes. I thought we were supposed to value individuals' interactions over processes, and here processes show up in the very principles that were created 20 years ago. So yeah, we still value processes to a large degree. And then the second part of this statement of constant pace, if we're going to say constant, why don't we just say immutable? I mean, we like the word immutable anyway, so let's just say that. No, so I think the literal statement of constant pace is overly specific. Back when I founded my company a long time ago, we thought we wanted a constant pace too, but eventually we realized that none of the people who were involved in the original founding of my company had ever actually worked at a constant pace. We actually realized that most of us, including me, had always done our best work in burst mode. We actually liked working hard for a while, and then we liked working not so hard for a while. So yeah, we want to work at a sustainable pace, but we don't really want to work at a constant pace. And personally, I would say that I don't find constant pace personally to be sustainable. I find the variation and rhythm of burst mode and then slowing down for a while to be more sustainable than constant pace per se. So overall, I find the spirit of this principle to be intact and still valid today, but the detailed wording is once again overly specific. And then we get the next principle. Continuous attention to technical excellence and good design enhances agility. And I think good design has proven to be a problematic phrase in Agile, especially considering the different needs of large and small projects. In the early days of Agile, we had this emphasis on you ain't going to need it, big design up front, the simplest thing that will work, and so on. And I think those were largely reactions to the bureaucratic excesses of the early 2000s. And so I think, and we have to recognize that the needs of projects change when you go from small projects to large projects. In the early days, Agile was nearly entirely about small projects, but as time has gone by, it has also become about large projects. And so in large projects, what constitutes good design is simply different than it is on small projects. And so I think, as with many of the other phrases in the principles, this would actually be a stronger phrase if it was simply shortened to continuous attention to technical excellence enhances agility. And let's not get into good design or bad design. Let's just say continuous attention to technical excellence enhances agility, and I think that is clearly a true statement. The less time we spend going back and fixing stuff, the more agile we're going to be able to be. The next principle is that simplicity, the art of maximizing the amount of work not done, is essential. And I think if we interpret this as promoting a focus on just-in-time planning, just-in-time requirements, just-in-time design, then I think this statement seems equally valid today. However, if that was the intent, I think it could have been stated more directly, because the statement doesn't say just in time. It talks about simplicity, and it doesn't talk about doing things at just the right time. It talks about not doing things at all. And so I think there's a tendency today to reinterpret some of these statements as how we might mean them if they were written today, but it's not how these statements were intended 20 years ago. And so I think this particular principle could be reinterpreted to mean what we mean it to say today, but instead let's just make a different statement instead that says exactly what we mean, which is about just in time. The next principle is that the best architectures, requirements, and designs emerge from self-organizing teams. I only see a couple of problems with this statement. Number one, I don't think it's stated as a principle, it's just an observation. Number two, I don't think it differentiates agile development from any other kind of development. Self-organizing, I guess, kind of has something to do with agile, but it can be used in a lot of other contexts too. Number three, it doesn't consider differences due to size, and maybe on small projects, the best architectures, requirements, and designs emerge from self-organizing teams. But if you have a 200-person project, I don't know how you're going to have that team be truly self-organizing in any meaningful sense of self-organizing. You can have a degree of self-organization at some level, but overall, it's not going to be self-organizing. And overall, I guess I just don't think this statement is probably true. I think it's highly debatable. You can define a context, a limited context where it's true, but I think if you start looking at the big wide world of software, there are an awful lot of contexts in which it is not true, and so I just don't think this principle applies. The last principle we'll look at is that the statement that at regular intervals the team reflects on how to become more effective and then tunes and adjusts its behavior accordingly. Number one, yeah, this is a great statement, but I think it reads like compromised language written by committee when we get phrases like regular intervals. What does regular interval mean? Does it mean frequently? Does it mean every month, every week? It's kind of hard to say. And then tunes and adjusts its behavior accordingly. Okay, that's a great statement. But I think the notion of frequency is missing. Regular intervals could be quarterly, could be monthly. I think in Agile we really would like to tune our behavior more often than that, ideally. I think a plan, do, check, act process in a waterfall environment would satisfy this principle as written. And so I think once again here, the spirit is valid, or at least what I interpret the spirit to be, but I think the detailed wording falls short. And then we've got this final point having to do with this particular principle which is, how about applying this idea to the Agile principles and values themselves? It's been 20 years, maybe at regular intervals. 20 years seems like a little bit of a long interval. Maybe we should reflect on how to become more effective and tune and adjust the Agile principles and values themselves. So my overall summary of the circa 2001 Agile principles in 2021 is that I think the spirit of many of these principles remain, but numerous specifics seem out of date, which is actually what you would expect after 20 years with no updates, right? We would expect them to be out of date, and of course I think they are. So I think aside from the elements that are out of date, or the details that are out of date, we have some elements that are just plain missing from the 2001 Statement of Principles and Values. The first one that's missing is high-level upfront planning with just-in-time detailed planning. That has just become a bread and butter part of Agile development and just completely missing from the Statement of Values and Principles. Second, high-level upfront requirements or stories with just-in-time detailed requirements or stories. Again, absolutely bread and butter aspect of Agile development and is nowhere to be found in the Statement of Principles and Values. Same thing with continuous testing. Really, testing statements are conspicuously and somewhat puzzlingly absent from the Statement of Values and Principles, but I think this has just become core to effective Agile development. And there's really nothing about testing anywhere in the Statement of Values or Principles other than maybe if we reinterpret the statement of continuous attention to technical excellence, but then that goes kind of sideways into talking about design. So I think it's really hard to reinterpret that as being about testing. And then this whole area of limiting work in progress or WIP just completely missing from the Statement of Principles and Values. I think these four elements in particular are just core to effective Agile development and nowhere to be found in the original statements of the Principles and Values. And so certainly any update for modern Statement of the Principles and Values would want to incorporate these elements. I think I've had conversations over the years, recent years in particular, with people who seem to be inclined to stretch the original statements of the values and principles to cover these points. But I think all that's really saying is that the original statements don't contradict what I'm saying today. But I think the bigger question is to take a step back and say, well, why would anyone want to stretch the language to cover these updates? That's a real question worth asking. And I think the reason that people want to stretch the language to cover the updates is that they want the original language to be in some sense sacred or immutable or unchangeable. And for whatever reason, there's a resistance to changing the language to keep up with the times. And I think that is because I think some people and teams have adopted the attitude that the Agile principles and values are inviolable rather than treating them as living statements that really should be kept up to date. I think that very attitude is not it's not an engineering attitude. It's not a business attitude. In fact, it's not really a practical attitude. And as such, I think it's misplaced. So my closing thoughts are, hopefully you can guess by now, I think the spirit of the 2001 Agile Values and Principles is alive and well, but many specific details are out of date. I think reverence for the 20-year-old principles and values is also misplaced. Reverence is not a technical concept. I think Agile would benefit from a shift in culture where we move toward regularly refining our principles and values more than from treating these principles and values as immutable. I think Agile practice has moved beyond 2001. It's time for Agile principles and values to do the same.